Well, good morning, everybody. Thank you for being here.
Good morning.
So this is a discussion of class. We're hearing in the Republican Party that the Democrats are waging class warfare, and this is a terrible thing. We're in the thrall of the Occupy movement that brings out this 1% and 99% that has so captured the imagination of the American people, and it's really everywhere. But 1% and 99% it's a metaphor, and metaphors can be a little tricky. So I think that what I want to do, and what the idea of this panel was to try to get underneath that metaphor and look at specifically what are we talking about with this 1% and 99% if we understand it in terms of class and the complications that come with a class understanding. So shamelessly, I do hold up this new edition of the Working Class Majority, which goes much more deeply into this than I can do here. So let me just start out and say that if we just leave it at income, like the 1%, that means about $500,000 a year in annual income for a household. In New York City, that's a doctor and a lawyer, or a senior editor and a very well-paid sanitation worker with a lot of overtime. You can get to $500,000 without a whole lot of trouble in New York, and those people are not the enemy. So if we just leave it at income, I think we're making a big mistake. And in general, if you look at class in terms of upper, middle, and lower, the working class disappears, the capitalist class disappears, and the whole dynamic that underlies our society disappears with that formulation, which is, of course, part of the point of having that formulation so broadly proposed. So I'm sure it won't be a surprise to people here that it's an important focal point to begin a discussion of class in terms of power. That when we talk about class, we're talking about power. We're talking about power because class is not a set of boxes that people fit into. Class is a relationship. So when you're in a relationship, right away, that means that it's a relationship of power and subordination. So when we talk about class, that's what what I want to encourage us to do. So then the principal classes that we have, of course, were the working class and the capitalist class. Understood in terms of power, we don't have a metric that you can look up in the Bureau of Labor Statistics. How much power does somebody have? We do know income, but we also know something else. We know people's occupation. So it's possible to look at something like 550 or 600 different occupational classifications and find out how many people are in each one of them, and then allocate those people across class lines to try to get some idea of who are people who are in the working class with rather little authority and power in their jobs, and that can be industrial workers, factory workers, it can be construction workers, but also, of course, service workers, people who sit in call centers with headphones on all day long, people who are bank tellers, people who are fixing the ATM machines, people who are cashiers, all that. You add them all up and you have 63% of the labor force in the United States is the working class. This is not a middle class society. 63% are in the working class, which is why this book is called The Working Class Majority, because that's really who is the core and the center of the American political and economic scene. And I think we really have to hold on to that when we start thinking about the relationship between class and democracy and political democracy, the relationship between politics and economics. This becomes an important point to try to hold on to. So if the working class is this group of people who are rather on the powerless side, then of course the people who have rather more power over them, and that's the capitalist class. And I would say that in a technical way, anybody who employs anybody, anybody who owns a business, anybody who has capital in that sense is a capitalist. But I don't think it helps to say that a small business owner who's got a little bodega or who's got a shopper who is delivering fuel oil in a small town and has a truck or two and a cousin who's driving a truck and his wife is keeping the books, that that's a capitalist. although technically that is a capitalist. So those people I want to put into the middle class. So I want to say a little word here about what do I mean by this middle class. Well, what is the middle class in the middle of? It's not exactly in the middle of an income distribution, although in general it is, but that's not a very good measure. It's in the middle of a power grid of labor and capital. So if you look at the experience of the middle class in this country, professional people, small business owners, and managers and supervisory personnel, those elements of the middle class whose lives are most closely associated with the working class have done very poorly, as the working class has suffered defeat after defeat and setback after setback in the last 40 years. Those elements of the middle class that are more or less associated with them, like community college teachers or K through 12 teachers in schools that serve working class kids, or people who are lawyers in legal aid and legal services, are taking it really very tough in the last 30 or 40 years as the class that they are associated with is on the decline. The same with small business owners. When a corporation decides to move the factory to China, the small businesses in that community also suffer from that. The big accounting firms that are also part of the middle class, the senior accountants who are managing that transfer, they do very well because they're obviously part of a middle class that is most closely associated with the capitalist class, and they get the pieces, of the action as they can negotiate from that capitalist class. So when we look at what's happened in the last 40 years with the tremendous change in distribution of income and wealth, that's very well documented. Everybody knows about it. We can talk about it very openly and easily. You look at that change in distribution of income and wealth, and it's tempting to say, well, there it is again. It's the rich getting richer and the poor getting poorer. Well, yes, except that that isn't very helpful. What I think we really need to understand that and to convey that to people is that's the capitalist taking it to the bank and the working class taking it in the neck. That is the class dynamic that's at play in those income and wealth data that are very often neglected, and I'm sure that it's no news to you here, but I've tried to just say that what's no news ought to be news to the larger society, and we need to take this message out. We need to take this way of thinking out and try to get people to understand these class dynamics in this sense. Now, if we look again at poverty, it's maybe beginning to look a little bit like it's coming back, but really poverty was a big question until the welfare reform of the middle 90s, when we could get away with welfare as we knew it, and then the poverty disappeared. It didn't disappear from society, but it disappeared as a political touchstone because the poor were playing a particular social role and political role as a scapegoat, as a target, as the other that could be identified as the source of our problems. Because if you've got a class formulation that says rich, middle, and poor, and most people are in the middle class, when that middle class, really, which we understand as the working class, is suffering, it's looking for a target of struggle. It's looking, who do you blame? It's very hard to go after the rich because a lot of people think that they're going to be rich. It's a very interesting problem. In 2000, in the Bush-Gore campaign, George W. had a tax plan. And Gore said, it's a tax just for the top 1%. And someone did a study and said, are you part of the 1%? They did a survey. 19% said yes. And another 21% said that they would be in the next 10 years or their children. Well, we can chuckle about that, but that has consequences. So if we want to say rich, middle, and poor, and now the problem is this broad middle is having problems, where's the target of struggle, right? It goes down to the poor. The poor played that role until welfare reform. Then it couldn't play that role anymore. They disappeared, and what came to take their place were immigrants. So that immigrants become the source of the problem. You know why you don't have a job? Because the immigrants are taking your job.
You know why the country's in such financial trouble? Is because the immigrants are getting health care and education. We can't have these immigrants. It's all lies. In this chapter 4 in here, I think, on poverty, I do a whole analysis of this discussion about immigration and why it's a mistake and why it's wrong and what social role it plays. It's not so easy to break through that social formulation without an explicit class analysis, without explicitly talking about, this is workers we're talking about. This is not some marginal other. And I think that in the liberal tradition, we have the discussion of poverty. Of course, the seminal work was Michael Harrington, and what was the name of the book? The Other America. Like, it's not us. Well, I think we need to come back and look at that more closely. Now, when we talk about class, it's very important, I think, also to understand, and this especially for Marxists, who like to think about class only in economic terms, that there is a race and gender crosscut to class and to the class experience. There is no single experience of the working class without understanding its valences if you are black, if you're Hispanic, if you're a man, a woman, gay or straight. Those things are very important crosscuts to understanding class, which is why we have the panel structured the way that we have it here. So I'm not going to go into those things except just to mark it and to point out that because class is cross-cut by race and gender, so race and gender are cross-cut by class. And so there's no simple way of understanding the women's movement or the black liberation movement or any other movement among those communities without understanding the class dynamics that are operating internal to them. So in the last couple of minutes that I've got here, let me just call your attention, which you may already know, to this Lewis Powell memo that was written in 1971. Lewis Powell, who later became a United States Supreme Court Justice appointed by Richard Nixon, wrote a memo to the Chamber of Commerce in 1971. Now, it's hard to believe what the political climate was in 1971 that led him to write this memo. Because in it, he starts out and he says, the corporate world is under attack in every venue. In the universities, in the courts, in the streets, in the pulpits, in every part of America, corporate world is under attack. And we have to respond to that, he says, not by our industry groups or by our particular companies, which are also under attack. We have to respond to the system, and we have to defend that system. And we have to develop a strategic program that over the next decades is going to reverse this trend that we are now suffering under, he said. And we have to have a broad strategic conception that goes to the development of think tanks, to getting universities behind a corporate agenda, to putting money up to do these things, to get into the courts, to change the way that the legal system works, to change the electoral map, all of those elements. And he laid it all out, and you know, for the last 40 years, that's what they've been doing. And as Jeffrey Clement, who wrote this book, Corporations Are Not People, points out, this Citizens United decision was like the end zone victory dance of this long campaign marching down the field. It didn't come out of nowhere. Now, what's so interesting and important for us is that the working class and the labor movement has nothing to match that, or nothing to match that in the way of conception or thinking or agenda. And without that, we're just on the way down further and further and further. There is no way to organize our way out of this thing shop by shop. There is no way to organize our way out of this thing community by community or constituency by constituency. This is a systemic problem that we're facing. And at the center of that, of course, is a class analysis inflected also by race, gender, and the other things that we need to know. But until we, in the labor movement, which is where I'm based, or in the community movements, in the immigrant rights movements, in the women's movements, in all the different social movements, come at this problem that we're facing together, on the foundation of a broad, class-based strategic goal and outline and set of policies, we're just going to have a very hard time. So I just want to say, once again, I have copies of this, $15. You got to do this. I'm sorry, folks, but I do have these here, and I'll be around to sell them at the end of the session. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Mayor,